Greetings and welcome to Monarch channel, guys. Hope everyone's doing fine and you are ready for some serial killer stories. Before we start, please hit subscribe button, like and share the video. If any of you have your own YouTube channel and you need some background videos, please visit my other channel, Monarch Free Videos. They are all copyright free and you can use it in any way you like. All I ask is for you to subscribe, like and share a link. You can find link to my copyright-free background videos in the description box. Okay, let's get started. Vinko Pintarić was a Croatian serial killer and outlaw who murdered 5 people over the course of 17 years and escaped from prisons and police takeouts on multiple occasions. His violent, vindictive nature and proficiency with firearms struck fear into inhabitants of Hrvatsko Zagorje, a region of northern Croatia where he spent years at large, hiding from the law enforcement and engaging in various crimes, until his death in 1991 in a shootout with the police. Media coverage of his exploits made Pintarić a household name in Croatia and Yugoslavia, and even brought him a degree of sympathy from the general public, who saw him as a Robin Hood-like figure and dubbed him Čaruga of Zagorje, after an infamous post-World War I outlaw Jozo Stanisavljević Čaruga. Pintarić was born in 1941 in Zrinski Topolovac near Bjelovar. During World War II, his father Ilija joined the partisan resistance, but near the end of the war he was taken away by Ustaše and spent several months with them. Because of this, in June 1945, Ilija was beaten by Department of National Security agents in the presence of his family, including Pintarić and his elder brother Josip, and then taken away. Pintarić's mother urged Ilija partisan comrades to intervene on his behalf, but they refused. Ilija never returned. According to rumors, he was shot the day after his arrest. Pintarić's mother remarried after a couple of years, and his alcoholic stepfather physically abused him. All these traumatic events instilled a permanent sense of betrayal in Pintarić and fueled his anger and resentment. He would often talk about avenging his father. In his adolescence, he developed an interest in firearms, using them for poaching. On several occasions, he had his illegal owned weapons confiscated by the police. His first marriage lasted only a couple of months. Angered by a demeaning treatment from his in-laws, he assaulted them, from which he spent some time in prison. He never returned to his wife. Instead, he moved to Zabok and married Katica Tisanić, a divorced woman with a child. They built a house in Zabok and had a daughter. For a while, Pintarić was a good husband and father, a man who wanted to move away from his traumatic childhood and failed marriage. Pintarić committed his first murder on 26 April 1973. On that day, he applied for a job in a local factory but was rejected. Disappointed over his repeated failures to secure a job in a factory and suspecting undue influence of his brother-in-law who were already employed there, he went to a local inn and drank heavily. On his way home, he got into a quarrel and physical confrontation with his neighbors. Pintarić went to his home to get a pistol, shot the neighbor dead and wounded his neighbor's tenant. He hid for 18 days before turning himself into the police. He was committed to Vrapče Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation, but he escaped from the institution on 18 September 1973 and went into hiding again. Pintarić was suspicious towards his wife, believing that she was helping the police to capture or even kill him. On 24 October 1973, Pintarić shot her dead through the window of his brother's house and fled into the night. Again, Pintarić was drunk when he committed the crime and had no recollection of the event on the following day. Only after inquiring about what had happened in Zabok, he realized that he had murdered his wife. Pintarić was captured on 20 January 1974. The police learned of his whereabouts and surrounded the house in which he was hiding. After brief negotiations, Pintaric surrendered without resistance. He was tried for 2 murders, an attempted murder, and endangering his neighbors by shooting at their homes. He admitted the crimes, but pleaded not guilty, arguing that he was provoked into murder while intoxicated. On 18 November 1974, he was pronounced guilty and sentenced to death, an outcome Pintaric had feared the most. However, to his relief, this was quickly commuted to 20 years imprisonment to maximum prison term under the law. Pintaric served his sentence in Stara Gradiška prison. Due to his good behavior, he was assigned duties which were not accessible to other prisoners, such as preparing coffee and growing flowers. Still, after 8 years in prison, some problems emerged, as Pintaric was issuing threats to his former neighbors. At the same time, he was petitioning for a leave. The authorities were aware of his threats and denied all his petitions, assigning that he might commit more crimes upon release. On 21 February 1982, Pintaric managed to escape from the prison by simply adding his name to a list of prisoners to be released on a leave. 5 days later, he wrote a letter to his attorney saying that he escaped because writing petitions made no sense anymore. He announced that he was going to kill a lot of people and that what he done was just the beginning. Pintaric got involved with Barbara Šipek. They lived together in her house and even went stealing together. She knew about his identity, as did the villagers. When she was apprehended by the police in April 1983, Pintaric barged into neighbor Kucelj family house armed with a shotgun and threatened to kill 30 people unless she was released. However, Milan and Matija Kucelj managed to surprise Pintaric and overpower him, hacking him with cleaver in the process. They left him for dead and promptly alarmed the Oroslavlje police. Pintaric was severely injured, but he survived. As a result of his injuries, he lost full use of his right arm. Pintaric was charged with threats, attempted murder, and 30 counts of robbery. He was again sentenced to 20 years and sent to Lepoglava prison. Life behind bars bored him, so he decided to escape again. On 3rd September 1989, he was given a day's leave from which he did not return. Pintaric went back to his outlaw lifestyle. He kept breaking into cottages across Hrvatsko Zagorje, carefully picking those which had a clear view towards the road and were close to a forest, making the escape easier. In June 1990, the police received a tip about Pintaric having been seen near Zabok. They talked to Rudolf Belina, owner of nearby cottage. A couple of days later, he was visited and shot dead by Pintaric, who thought Belina had betrayed him to the authorities. Shortly after that, Pintaric murdered Barbara Šipek's neighbor for having killed one of her chickens. The fifth and final victim was Božo Habek, shot dead on 2nd August 1990, simply for asking the already paranoid Pintaric if he was looking for somebody. The police were closing in on Pintaric and twice came very near to apprehending him. However, on both of these occasions, Pintaric opened fire, wounded a policeman and managed to escape. By 1991, the Zabok police has set up a team dedicated to locating and capturing Pintaric. Over time, they learned more about his habits. He was getting increasingly careless, partly due to alcohol abuse. In May 1991, they received information that Pintaric was visiting his lover Ankica Vuhiniček and decided to set up a stakeout on her house near Veliko Trgovišće. On the third night, the policemen saw a man coming from the woods and approaching the house. After they radioed for the backup, they were joined by a special forces from Kumrovec, and then compound was quickly surrounded. When Pintaric exited the house in the morning, he was called to surrender, but he opened fire instead. There was a brief exchange in which Pintaric was wounded and he ran back into the house. He still refused to surrender and asked for his attorney. When the attorney came, Pintaric asked him to come to the house, which the police did not allow. By noon of the same day, it was apparent that voluntary surrender was very unlikely, and the police fired tear gas in the compound. Pintaric then shot Buhinicek in the stomach, accusing her of ratting him, and fired on the police. One of the policemen then entered the house and killed Pintaric with a single gunshot to the head. Buhinicek survived the shooting. Pintaric is buried in the Lepoglava cemetery in an unmarked grave. Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was an American serial killer, child rapist and cannibal. He was also known as a Grave Man, the Werewolf of Hysteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac and the Boogeyman. Fish once boasted that he had children in every state, and at one time stated his number of victims was about 100. However, it is not known whether he was referring to rapes and cannibalization, nor is it known if the statement was truthful. Fish was suspect in at least 5 murders during his lifetime. He confessed to 3 murders that police were able to trace to unknown homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Fish was apprehended on December 13, 1934, and put on trial for kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd. He was convicted and executed by electric chair on January 16, 1936, at the age of 65. His crimes were dramatized in the 2007 film The Gray Man. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870, to Randall and Eileen Fish. Fish's father was American of English ancestry and his mother was Scottish-Irish American. His father was 43 years older than his mother and 75 years old at the time of his birth. Fish was the youngest and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie and Edwin. He wishes to be known as Albert after a dead sibling and to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs that he was given at the orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. Fish family had a history of mental illnesses. His uncle suffered from mania, one of his brothers was confined in the state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had visual hallucinations. Fish's father Randall was a riverboat captain and by 1870 a fertilizer manufacturer. The older Fish died in 1875 at Washington's 6th Street station of a heart attack. The Congressional Cemetery records show that he died on October 16, 1875 and was buried on October 19, 1875 in Gray Air 96/89. Fish's mother then put her son into St. John Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently abused. Fish began to enjoy the physical pain that the beatings brought. Of his time at the orphanage, Fish remarked, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and there where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." By 1880, Fish's mother had a government job and was able to remove Fish from the orphanage. In 1882, at age of 12, he began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces. Fish began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress and spend a great portion of his weekends on these visits. Throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose names he acquired from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. By 1890, Fish arrived in New York City, and he said at that point he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Marie Hoffman, who was 9 years his junior. They had 6 children: Alberta, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Throughout 1898, Fish worked as a house painter. He said he continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum, where Fish was fascinated by a bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with the sexual mutilation. In 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny, convicted and incarcerated in Sing Sing. Around 1910, while he was working at Wilmington, Delaware, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. He took Kedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It is unclear whether or not Fish forced Kedden to do these things, but in his confessions he implied that the man was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Fish took Kedden to an old farmhouse where he began to torture him. The torture took place over 2 weeks. Fish eventually tied Kedden up and cut off half of his penis. "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me," Fish later recalled. He originally intended to kill Kedden, cut up his body and take it home, but he was fearful the hot weather would draw attention to him. Instead, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left the 10-box bill, kissed Kedden goodbye and left. "Took first train I could to get back home. Never heard what became of him or tried to find out," Fish said. In January 1917, Fish's wife left him for John Straub, a handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish then had to raise his children as a single parent. After his arrest, Fish told newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. He began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of the John the Apostle. It was about the time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm. He even embed needles in his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, X-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. He also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded pedal and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid in his anus and set it alight. While Fish was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to pedal his buttock with the same nail-studded pedal he used to abuse himself. He soon developed a growing obsession with cannibalism, often preparing himself a dinner consisting solely of raw meat and sometimes serving it to his children. In about 1919, Fish stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. He chose people who were either mentally handicapped or African American as his victim, explaining that he assumed those people would not be missed when killed. Fish would later claim to have occasionally paid boys to procure other children for him. Fish tortured, mutilated and murdered young children with his impalements of hell, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife and a small handsaw. On July 11, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' farm on Staten Island, New York. He offered her some money to come and help him look for a rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away. Fish left but returned later to Keel's barn when he tried to sleep but was discovered by Beatrice's father and forced to leave. During 1924, the 54-year-old Fish, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. Shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, Fish attempted to test his impalements of hell on a child he had been molesting named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friend were playing box ball on a sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said that they had not, he invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. While the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged the mattress. Underneath was a knife, a small handsaw and a meat cleaver. They became frightened and ran out of the apartment. Fish remarried on February 6, 1930 in Waterloo, New York to Estella Wilcox, but divorced after only 1 week. Fish was arrested in May 1930 for sending an obscure letter to a woman who answered an advertisement for a maid. Following that arrest and the one in 1931, he was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation. On May 25, 1928, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." On May 28, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretenses of hiring Edward. He later confessed that he planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. Fish introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingale, New York. He promised to hire Bud and his friend Willie, and said he would send for them in a few days. Fish failed to show up, but he sent a telegram to the Budd family apologizing and set a later date. When Fish returned, he met Edward's younger sister Grace Budd. He apparently changed his intended victim from Edward to Grace and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. He convinced the parents, Delia and Albert Budd I, to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. Grace had a younger sister, Beatrice, two older brothers, Edward and George, and a young brother, Albert Budd II. Grace left with Fish that day, but never returned. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5, 1930, as a suspect in the Grace's disappearance, accused by Pope's estranged wife. He spent 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22, 1930. He was found not guilty. In November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to Grace's parents, which ultimately led the police to Fish. Mrs. Budd was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it to her. The unaltered letter, complete with Fish's misspellings and grammatical errors, reads, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894 a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and two others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering amongst the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you want cut from it. A boy or girl behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as well cuttled broth in the highest price." John stated there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole two boys, one 7, one 11. Took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they own. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At the time I was living at 409 E 100th Street, rear, right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 W 15th Street, bought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked white flowers. I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite and stretch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not F her, though I could have if I wished, so she died a virgin. Police investigated the letter. The story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified. The part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace, however, was found to be accurate in the description of kidnapping and subsequent events, although it was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish has actually eaten parts of Grace's body. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NUPCBA. A janitor at the company told the police he has taken some of the stationery home, but left it at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. The landlady of the rooming house said that the Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money and asked her to hold his next check for him. William King was the chief investigator for the case. King waited outside of the room until Fish returned. Fish agreed to go to headquarters for questioning, then took a razor blade. King disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters. Fish made no attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd, saying that he meant to go to the house to kill Grace's brother Edward. Fish said it never even entered his head to rape the girl, but he later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. This information was used at trial to make the claim the kidnapping was sexually motivated, thus avoiding any mention of cannibalism. Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11, 1935 in White Plains, New York. Frederick P. Close presided as judge and Westchester County Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert F. Gallagher was prosecuting attorney. Fish's defense counsel was James Dempsey, a former prosecutor and one-time major of Peekskill, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Fish pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes. Dempsey in his summation noted that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical records were there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities. The defense chief expert witness was Frederick Wertham, a psychiatrist with an emphasis on child development, who conducted psychiatric examination for New York crime courts. During 2 days of testimony, Wertham explained Fish's obsession with religion and specifically his preoccupation with the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. Wertham said that Fish believed that similarly sacrificing a boy would be penance for his own sin, and that even if the act itself was wrong, angels would prevent it if God did not approve. Fish attempted the sacrifice once before, but was stopped when a car drove past. Edward Budd was the next intended victim, but he turned out to be larger than expected, so he settled on Grace. Although he knew Grace was female, it is believed that Fish perceived her as a boy. Wertham then detailed Fish's cannibalism, which in his mind he associated with communion. The last question Dempsey asked Wertham was 15,000 words long. detailed Fish's life and ended with asking how the doctor considered his mental condition based on this life. Wareham simply answered, "He is insane." Gallagher cross-examined Wentham on whether Fish knew the difference between right and wrong. He responded that he did know, but it was a perverted knowledge based on his opinions of sin and religion, and thus was an insane knowledge. The defense called 2 more psychiatrists to support Wareham's findings. The first of 4 rebuttal witnesses was Menas Gregory, the former manager of Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital, where Fish was treated during 1930. He testified that Fish was abnormal but sane. Under cross-examination, Dempsey asked if corpophilia, urophilia and pedophilia indicated a sane or insane person. Gregory replied that such a person was not mentally sick, and that these were common perversions that were socially perfectly alright, and that Fish was no different from millions of other people, some very prominent and successful, who suffered from the very same perversions. The next witness was the resident physician at the Thames, Perry Lichtenstein. Dempsey objected to a doctor with no training in psychiatry testifying on the issue of the sanity, but Justice Clause overruled on the basis that the jury could decide what weight to give a prison doctor. When asked whether Fish's causing himself pain indicated a mental condition, Lichtenstein replied, "This is not a masochism, as he was only punishing himself to get sexual gratification." The next witness, Charles Lambert, testified that coprophobia was a common practice and that religious cannibalism may be psychiatric but was a matter of taste and not evidence of psychosis. The last witness, James Vavassor, repeated Lambert's option. Another defense witness was Mary Nicholas, Fish's 70-year-old stepdaughter. She described how Fish taught her and her brother and sister several games involving overtones of masochism and child molestation. None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but ultimately, as one later explained, they felt he should be executed anyway. They found him to be sane and guilty, and the judge ordered his death sentence. Fish arrived at prison in March 1935 and was executed on January 16, 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in a Sing Sing prison cemetery. Fish is said to have helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. His last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." According to one witness present, it took 2 jolts before Fish died, creating the rumor that the apparatus was short-circuited by the needles that Fish inserted into his body. These rumors were later regarded as untrue, as Fish reportedly died in the same fashion and the time frame as others in the electric chair. At a meeting with reporters after the execution, Fish's lawyer, Dempsey, revealed that he was in possession of his client's final statement. This amounted to several pages of handwritten notes that Fish apparently penned in the hours just prior to his death. When pressed by the assembled journalists to reveal the document's content, Dempsey refused, saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Thank you guys for stopping by. Hope you liked these stories. Before you leave, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you have any stories, true or fictional, or maybe you have some scary videos you would like to submit, email is in the description box. And if you need any copyright-free background videos, subscribe to our other channel, Monarch Free Videos, as well. Links are down there. Just put a link to your description box. That's all. No permissions needed. Stay safe and I'll see you soon.